Hello my friend, welcome back to the channel. It always amazes me how many of you tune in from different corners of the world, so take a second and tell me where you're watching from today. I love seeing our community grow in places I never expected. If you're one of the people who keeps returning, may God bless you. Your support is the reason we can keep sharing stories that touch the heart and remind us how complicated real relationships can be. Now, today's story is one I want you to listen to carefully. It starts with a husband who thought he was uncovering infidelity. He set up a hidden camera, convinced he was about to expose his wife. But what he discovered inside his own home wasn't a lover. It was a truth that hurt far deeper. I set a camera in my own living room because I was sure my wife was cheating on me. I expected to catch a stranger walking through my front door or hear whispers meant for someone else. But the footage I saw didn't show romance, late-night visits, or anything close to what I feared. It revealed something far heavier, something that made my suspicion feel small compared to what she was actually planning. Her secret didn't involve another man. It involved my home, my future, and a decision she made long before I even realized our marriage was shifting. What I uncovered didn't break my trust in one moment. It changed the foundation of our relationship entirely. Reed Coleman was the kind of man people described as steady. He worked long hours as an HVAC technician in Cincinnati, spending most of his days climbing in and out of attics, basements, and overheated apartments. His hands were rough, his back often sore, but he never complained. He took pride in being dependable, the person others could call when something needed fixing, pipes, vents, or life in general. Home was a small two-bedroom house on a quiet street. Nothing fancy, but it carried a warmth he had spent years building with his wife, Mallory. They had been married for 6 years, and during most of that time, they lived simply. They shared morning coffee when their schedules allowed, swapped stories about difficult customers and difficult patients, and wound down in the evenings with whatever show they were slow watching together. Their life wasn't glamorous, but it felt solid. Mallory worked as a nurse with an unpredictable schedule. Some days she walked through the door before sunset. Other times she came home past midnight, dropping her bag by the counter and kicking off her shoes with a sigh. Reed adjusted to that rhythm easily. He cooked when she was too tired, handled errands when her shifts were long, and offered quiet support when she needed space after a rough day in the hospital. They talked often about growing their family. Nothing urgent, nothing pressured, just gentle possibilities tossed into the air on slow evenings. A child, someday. A dog, maybe next year. Weekend getaways they never quite planned but always enjoyed imagining. But over the last few months, those light conversations faded. Mallory's smiles became shorter. Her evenings grew quieter. She answered questions without looking up and rushed through mornings like she was late for something she never explained. Reed noticed the changes, but he didn't push. He assumed it was work stress or exhaustion. Nurses carried other people's pain for a living, and he tried to give her room to breathe. Still, little things stood out. Her phone stayed face down on the table. She took calls in the hallway or outside, even when it was cold. She flinched when he entered the room unexpectedly, as if she needed a second to adjust. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, just a rough season, something every couple went through. But the small shifts in her behavior began to pile up quietly in his mind, forming a tension he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Reed didn't know it yet, but his home was about to feel very different. And the truth behind Mallory's distant behavior was nothing like what he feared. But it would challenge everything he believed about their marriage. Before things shifted in their marriage, Reed carried a quiet sense of pride about the life he and Mallory built together. He remembered the early days clearly, how she used to come home from nursing school exhausted yet still smiling, dropping her backpack on the couch and leaning into him with the softness of someone who felt safe. Back then, their evenings were filled with small routines that meant more than either of them admitted. She would sit at the dining table, textbooks spread out, while Reed cooked simple meals. He wasn't a great cook, but she cheered him on anyway, even when the pasta was too soft or the chicken too dry. Mallory often studied late. Reed kept her company, folding laundry or watching muted TV so she wouldn't lose focus. Sometimes she fell asleep over her notes, and he would take the pen from her hand gently and guide her to bed. She would mumble appreciation, half asleep, trusting him with the small parts of her day that nobody else saw. Those nights gave him a sense of purpose. It wasn't just love, it was the feeling of being part of a shared effort, two people building toward a future they believed in. When she finally graduated, Reed stood clapping in the crowd, surrounded by families cheering for their loved ones. He wasn't loud, but he was steady. He brought flowers, hugged her tight, and whispered that he always knew she could do it. Mallory cried into his shoulder that day, overwhelmed in the best way. They drove home with the windows down, music playing, excitement buzzing through the car like it was a second heartbeat. Their first year of marriage felt just as hopeful. They moved into their modest house, a little creaky in some spots, but charming in the ways that made them laugh. Reed spent weekends fixing things, tightening cabinet hinges, repainting the front door, replacing old light fixtures. Mallory decorated slowly, choosing curtains and rugs with care. Their home became a reflection of both of them, filled with attempts, jokes, and late-night decisions about where to place photos. Conversations about having children came gradually. They didn't pressure each other, they simply dreamed out loud. On Saturdays, while grocery shopping, Mallory would pause near the baby aisle, smiling at tiny socks or soft blankets. Reed would make quiet jokes about how their kid would definitely inherit her stubbornness or his clumsiness. Those light moments were filled with innocent hope. Even if they weren't ready yet, the possibility alone was comforting. But life began to change in small, almost invisible ways. The first thing Reed noticed was how Mallory stopped leaving her phone on the table screen up. It wasn't unusual before, she'd lay it down casually, letting messages flash. But suddenly, it was always face down, sometimes tucked under a jacket or placed inside her bag. At first, he brushed it off. Everyone had moments when they wanted privacy. But over time, the pattern grew clear. Her emotional energy shifted too. She came home quieter, offering tired smiles that didn't reach her eyes. She didn't lean into him the way she used to. When he asked about her day, she answered in short lines, nothing rude, just distant. He didn't want to pry or make her feel cornered, so he gave her space. Yet the more space he gave, the more she seemed to drift away, as if the distance itself was becoming comfortable for her. Then came the calls from her sister, Devon. They weren't unusual in themselves, the sisters were close. But Mallory started stepping out to take those calls more often, even in winter when the cold bit at her skin. She'd wrap herself in a coat, walk out to the porch, and talk in a low voice that Reed could barely hear. When she hung up, she would return with a brittle expression, as if she'd been holding in something heavy. Every time Reed gently asked if everything was all right, she reassured him with a quick, yeah, just family stuff, then changed the subject. Reed tried not to read into it, but he couldn't ignore the shift in her moods. She seemed distracted, always thinking a few steps ahead, carrying tension she wouldn't explain. He worried she was overwhelmed by work, especially with the long shifts she often pulled. Nurses saw hard things, things that weighed on the heart. He assumed she was just dealing with the emotional strain of the job. But the night he heard her crying in the bathroom, something inside him twisted. It was late, past 1 a.m. He woke to the faint sound of running water, covering the sound of her voice. It wasn't the soft, tired crying of someone having a rough day. It sounded heavier, restrained, like she was holding herself together by force. He approached the door quietly and asked if she was okay. Mallory sniffed, steadied her voice, and said she was fine. When she finally stepped out, her eyes were slightly red, but she offered a quick explanation, just a headache. Reed didn't push further. He didn't want to make her uncomfortable, but he felt the growing weight of being shut out. He wanted to help her, but he couldn't reach her through the wall she'd built. He hoped she would open up in time, and he blamed himself for not knowing how to approach her without making things worse. Still, the signs accumulated. She stopped touching him casually, no more hands brushing as they walked past each other, no more resting her head on his shoulder at the end of a long day. She began sitting on the far side of the couch instead of next to him. Their laughter, a sound he barely noticed until it faded, became rare. Through all this, Reed held on to the belief that relationships go through phases. People get tired, busy, overwhelmed. He didn't want to assume the worst. He chose patience. He chose hope. He chose to believe that Mallory would eventually tell him what she was struggling with. But as the small changes continued to pile up, he began to feel something he hadn't felt in years, the quiet fear of losing someone he loved without understanding why. And for Reed, that fear would become the reason he took a step he never imagined, one that opened the door to a truth more painful than infidelity. The night everything shifted didn't start with suspicion. It started with Mallory not being in bed when Reed reached out for her. He stirred awake close to midnight, noticing the space beside him was empty and her pillow still warm. It wasn't unusual for her to get up when she couldn't sleep, so he assumed she was in the kitchen or the bathroom. He sat up slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the dim room, and stepped into the hallway. A faint light glowed from the direction of the guest room, a place she rarely went at night. He took a few quiet steps, intending to check if she was all right, when a sharp whisper stopped him before he reached the door. Mallory's voice. Urgent. He froze. The door was slightly open, just enough for her words to slip through. I can't let him ruin this. We need to be ready before he gets in the way. Once everything is set, I'll talk to him. Not before. Reed's breath stalled. His first instinct was to step inside, to ask what she meant, to demand context, but his body wouldn't move. The tone of her voice pinned him in place. It wasn't exhaustion or stress. It was determination mixed with fear, a tone she had never used around him. He leaned in, not touching the door, just close enough to steady his breathing. Her voice softened afterward, too low to catch the rest, but the phrases he had already heard were enough to send a cold rush down his spine. He stepped back slowly, careful not to make the floor creak. He didn't want to interrupt her. He didn't want her to know he heard. Not yet. His mind was racing too fast to form the right words. He moved into the dark kitchen and gripped the counter with both hands. The refrigerator's soft hum filled the silence, grounding him while his thoughts spun out. Ruin what? Get in the way of who? What was she planning? He had never heard his wife talk about him like that, not even during their worst disagreements. A minute later, her footsteps crossed the hallway. He quickly slipped back into the bedroom and lay down, eyes open, pretending to sleep. Mallory entered quietly and eased into the bed beside him. She didn't know he was awake. She didn't know he'd heard everything. Reed stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of her whispered words pressing deeper into his chest. Something had shifted in his home, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. Reed stayed awake long after Mallory drifted back into sleep. Her whispered words replayed in his mind with a sharp clarity that left him uneasy. He wanted to shake her awake and demand an explanation. He wanted to walk back to that guest room, open the door, and force the truth into the open. But he couldn't move. His body felt heavy with confusion, and his thoughts tangled together in a way that made it hard to even form a question. Part of him felt blindsided. How could the woman he trusted speak about him as if he was a burden, as if he stood in the way of something important? Another part felt anxious, quietly afraid of what he might hear if he confronted her unprepared. He lay still, listening to the slow rhythm of her breathing beside him, trying to understand how their home had become a place where she hid plans and whispered in the dark. The next morning he acted as if nothing had happened. He greeted Mallory softly, poured her a cup of coffee, and asked about her shift. She responded in the same distant way she had been lately, polite, tired, guarded. Reed watched her closely, searching for any sign she might reveal something on her own. But she didn't. She moved through the morning with practiced routine, leaving for work with a kiss on his cheek that felt lighter than it used to. When the door closed behind her, Reed finally exhaled the breath he had held since the night before. He knew he couldn't accuse her based on a few overheard lines. He needed clarity, certainty, proof of what was happening when he wasn't home. By midday, while sitting in his work van between service calls, he made his choice. He ordered a small hidden camera disguised as a desk clock, telling himself it was the only way to understand the truth without pushing her further away. He hated the idea of spying, but the alternative, living in confusion, felt worse. I just need proof, he whispered to himself, not out of anger, but out of a desperate need to stop wondering what she meant when she said he might ruin something she was planning. When the camera arrived 2 days later, he installed it quietly while Mallory worked another late shift, placing it on a living room shelf angled toward the hallway and guest room door. He stepped back, uneasy but resolute. If she wouldn't let him into her world, he would have to watch from the edges until he found the truth she wasn't willing to share. 2 days after installing the camera, Reed was on a service call inside an older apartment building. He was halfway through checking a malfunctioning furnace when his phone buzzed in his pocket. It wasn't a text, just the alert from the camera app he had nearly forgotten about in the rush of his workday. He wiped his hands on his uniform pants and stepped into the hallway to get better signal before opening the notification. The live feed loaded slowly, but when the image sharpened, he saw Mallory stepping inside their home with a delivery worker behind her. The worker pushed a dolly carrying 2 large, taped boxes stacked on top of each other. They weren't the size of something small like kitchen supplies or decorations. These boxes were bulky, tall, and heavy enough that the delivery worker had to angle them sideways to fit through the doorway. Reed's heartbeat picked up. Mallory hadn't mentioned any orders, and these looked nothing like the casual packages she sometimes bought for the house. He watched closely as she guided the worker down the hallway toward the guest room. She didn't look excited or surprised. She looked focused, almost tense, as if she had been waiting for them to arrive. When the worker asked, "Where would you like these?" Mallory pointed to the guest room without hesitation. "In there, please." "Against the wall." The short exchange made Reed's stomach knot. Why the guest room? Why the secrecy? She hadn't mentioned needing storage or furniture, and nothing about those boxes looked like simple home goods. He leaned against the hallway wall of the apartment complex, staring at his phone as the worker left and Mallory closed the door behind the boxes. Reed waited for her to open one, but she didn't. She stood there for a moment, hands on her hips, staring at the closed door as if gathering her thoughts. Then she turned swiftly and walked out of the camera's view. A wave of unease washed over Reed. It wasn't just the boxes themselves, it was the way she handled them, the silence surrounding the entire situation. She moved like someone completing a task she had long prepared for, not someone making a spontaneous purchase. He checked the time. He had another appointment in 15 minutes, but his mind was nowhere near work. He kept replaying the footage in his head, the size of the boxes, the delivery worker's strained posture, Mallory's expression that hinted at something bigger than a simple delivery. Reed closed the camera app and forced himself back into the furnace room, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the boxes marked the first visible sign of a plan he wasn't part of. Something about his home no longer felt steady, and the certainty he once relied on was beginning to slip. 3 days later, Reed was eating lunch alone in the front seat of his work van. It was a quiet afternoon, overcast with a light chill in the air. He took a bite of his sandwich when his phone buzzed again with another motion alert. His stomach tightened. Last time, the alert had brought more questions than answers. He opened the app, preparing for anything, yet not prepared at all. Mallory was pacing the living room with her phone held in front of her, the call clearly on speaker. Her movements were tense, sharper than her usual energy. The sound came through the feed clearly enough for him to hear the other voice, Devon's voice. "Mal, we don't have time to keep going back and forth about this," Devon said, sounding frustrated. "She needs stability. She needs someone with her. You can't delay this anymore." "I'm not delaying anything," Mallory snapped back, stopping in the middle of the living room. "I'm trying to figure out how to do this without turning my home into a war zone." Reed's chest tightened. "War zone?" He leaned closer to the screen, feeling a rush of anxiety that made the sandwich in his hand suddenly taste like nothing. Devon didn't soften her tone. "If Reed can't handle this, Mom and I won't move in. She needs calm. If there's tension in that house, we can't come." Reed froze. Move in? Tension? He felt a strange combination of shock and confusion. The idea that Mallory's mother was seriously ill had never crossed his mind. She hadn't shared hospital visits, late-night emergencies, or any signs of decline. He assumed her family updates were routine. Hearing it like this, through a camera feed, sent a cold pulse through him. Mallory ran a hand through her hair, sighing heavily. "You know how he is, Dev. He shuts down when things get heavy. I can't deal with that on top of everything else." Reed's eyes stung. He had been there for her through grief, long shifts, exhaustion, doubt. Yet now she described him as someone who couldn't carry his part. Mallory's voice quieted. I don't know how to tell him. And if he reacts badly, I can't risk Mom feeling unwanted. Reed leaned back in his seat, pulse loud in his ears. She wasn't talking about betrayal in the way he feared. She was talking about a future without him. It wasn't another man upsetting their marriage. It was a life-changing decision formed without him, based on fears she never spoke aloud. He closed the app slowly and rested his head against the seat, wishing he understood why she believed he wouldn't stand by her. The fear building in his chest wasn't jealousy anymore. It was dread. Something was already happening in his home, and he was just now realizing how far behind he was. Reed returned home early one afternoon between appointments and sat in his van for a minute, debating whether to check the camera feed again. A part of him didn't want to. Each new alert chipped away at the certainty he once had about his marriage. But avoiding the truth wouldn't change anything, so he opened the app. The view showed two delivery workers maneuvering a folded medical bed through the doorway. It wasn't subtle. The metal frame glinted under the hallway light, and the workers struggled slightly as they turned it sideways to fit through the space. Mallory hovered nearby, giving directions with short nods. Careful with the walls, please, she said. I need it set up in the guest room. Her voice sounded calm, but there was a strain beneath it, an urgency she couldn't hide. Reed watched as they carried the bed into the very room she had whispered in a few nights earlier. The boxes from before were pushed to the corner, waiting. He hadn't seen inside them yet, but now he didn't need to. They were part of this setup. When the workers finished, they handed her a clipboard. She signed quickly, thanked them, and closed the door behind them. For a moment, she stood with her hand on the doorknob, shoulders slumping as if the weight of the situation had settled on her. Reed watched her walk into view again and sit on the edge of the couch. She took out her phone and dialed someone. They delivered it, she said quietly. I'll have everything ready before they release her. I can't tell him yet. Not until I know exactly what we're facing. She paused, listening. No, I'm not trying to keep secrets. I'm trying to hold things together. He takes bad news hard. I need him steady, not panicked. Reed felt that line land like a blow. She thought he couldn't handle it? That he would fall apart instead of trying to help? The frustration mixed with sadness inside him, making it hard to swallow. He knew her mother had health issues in the past, but Mallory never gave details. She always said things were fine or being handled. He never imagined it was this serious. A medical bed meant long-term care, maybe end-of-life care. It meant their home was about to become a place where someone very sick would live. He wasn't angry at the need. He wasn't angry about her mother. He was hurt because he wasn't given a chance to stand beside her during something so heavy. He stared at his phone long after the feed ended. The jealousy he once felt was gone, replaced with a quiet fear that he and Mallory no longer made decisions together. The life they shared was being rearranged without him. He began to understand just how far the plans in that house had gone without him. Reed didn't expect another alert that evening. He had just parked in their driveway after work but stayed seated for a minute, letting the engine idle as he finished a call with a customer. When the alert flashed on his screen, something in him hesitated. The previous alerts had already taken a toll. Still, curiosity tugged at him, and he tapped the notification. The scene opened on Mallory standing in the middle of the living room. She wasn't on the phone this time. She wasn't receiving a delivery. She stood alone, hands clasped and shoulders hunched slightly forward, like someone preparing for an uncomfortable conversation. Reed watched as she took a deep breath and began speaking softly to the empty room. I care about you, she said, staring at a blank spot on the wall. But things have changed. I don't know how to do this without hurting you, and I'm tired of pretending everything is fine. She paused, biting her lip as if searching for the right words. My mom is coming here. She needs full care, and I can't risk her feeling unwelcome or dealing with tension on top of her condition. We've grown apart. You've been distant. I don't think this home is the best place for her with the way things are. Reed's breath hitched. He was watching his marriage being dismantled in slow motion. She wasn't just planning for her mother, she was planning for him to leave. Mallory tried the lines again, adjusting her tone. Reed, I think it's better if we take space. At least while she's here. I need a calm environment for her recovery, and you have your own battles. I can't manage both. Again, she stopped and lowered her head. Then she tried once more, this time sounding more firm. I think we should separate. It's the best choice for everyone. Reed's hand shook as he held his phone. The woman he loved was practicing the words that would push him out of his own home, and he had no idea she felt this strongly about anything. He hadn't been given a chance to try, to help, to understand. She wasn't cheating. She wasn't hiding another man. She was hiding a plan where he didn't belong. For Reed, that realization cut deeper than any affair ever could. He sat in the driveway for a long time, unable to move, unable to step inside. The weight of her words pressed on him until he felt hollow. The camera had given him clarity, but at a cost he wasn't prepared for. When Reed finally stepped out of his van that evening, the weight of everything he had seen pressed heavily on his chest. The jealousy that once clouded his thoughts had faded completely. What filled its place was something far more painful, the understanding that Mallory wasn't pulling away to be with someone else. She was pulling away to build a version of her life that didn't include him. She was preparing the house for her mother, preparing herself for a difficult season, and preparing him to be gone. Watching her practice Ines about separation made it impossible for him to pretend that things would eventually return to normal. She had already imagined a future with her mother under their roof and him somewhere else, removed from the daily decisions, the caregiving, and the emotional load she believed he wasn't ready for. It wasn't betrayal in the way he feared, it was abandonment built on assumptions she never gave him a chance to address. Reed sat with that truth for a while, breathing slowly until the shock settled into something steadier. He wasn't ready to lose his marriage, but he also couldn't continue watching from the outside while she reshaped their home and spoke about him like a problem to solve. The only way forward was honesty, even if it cracked everything open. He decided he would come home early the next day when she expected him to be on a late shift. He would walk into the living room, the same room where she rehearsed the words meant to remove him, and ask her directly what she was planning and why he had been left out. He wasn't going to raise his voice or accuse her of anything. He simply needed the truth spoken aloud, not whispered behind closed doors or acted out in preparation for his exit. It scared him to imagine her response. She might confirm her decision. She might tell him that his presence during her mother's decline would add more stress than support. But even with that fear, Reed knew this confrontation was necessary. He deserved clarity, and Mallory deserved a chance to explain herself without the shield of secrecy. Whatever came from that moment, whether healing or the end of their marriage, he decided he would face it with a steady voice and open eyes. He owed himself that much. Reed arrived home earlier than usual the next afternoon, parking a short distance away so his truck wouldn't alert Mallory or Devon. He sat inside for a moment, gathering enough strength to face what he had spent days watching through a screen. The sun was still up, filling the neighborhood with a soft, fading light. It felt strange walking toward his own house with the same tension someone might feel approaching a difficult appointment. He took a slow breath, placed his hand on the doorknob, and stepped inside. The living room was quiet except for the low murmur of two familiar voices. Mallory and Devon sat on the couch with paperwork spread across the coffee table. Discharge forms, medication lists, and home care instructions were scattered in front of them. It looked less like casual planning and more like the center of a major decision. They didn't notice him at first. When Reed's footsteps hit the hallway floor, both women turned sharply. Mallory's eyes widened. Devon straightened as if bracing for something unpredictable. "Reed," Mallory said, her voice thin. I thought you were working late." "I know," he replied, stepping fully into the room. "That's what you expected." Devon glanced between them, sensing the change immediately. "Maybe I should go." "No," Reed said gently but firmly. "You can stay. You already know more about what's happening in this house than I do." Mallory's shoulders stiffened. She looked down at the paperwork, then back at him. "This isn't how I wanted to talk to you." Reed moved closer, stopping at the edge of the coffee table. "How did you want to talk to me? In a rehearsed speech? Alone in this room after making plans without me?" Mallory's face tightened with guilt. You weren't supposed to hear that. But I did, he said quietly. Every word. Devon gave Mallory a troubled look, silently urging her to speak, but Mallory's throat worked like she was swallowing a knot that refused to go down. Reed pointed to the papers. So this is what's been happening? All the calls. All the deliveries. The bed in the guest room. Everything you've hidden from me. Mallory clasped her hands together, trying to steady herself. My mom is coming home from the hospital. They can't do anything else for her. She needs round-the-clock care, and they're discharging her soon. There wasn't time to ease into the conversation. I've been trying to keep everything from falling apart, Reed. You didn't have to keep it from me, he said, his voice softer now. You just had to tell me. Mallory shook her head slightly, as if the truth was too heavy to release. I know that's what a marriage is supposed to look like. But this situation is bigger than the two of us. My mom deserves a calm environment. She's scared. I'm scared. And I couldn't risk you shutting down the way you do when something overwhelming shows up. Reed frowned. Shutting down? Mallory, people get quiet when they're trying to process. That doesn't mean they won't show up when it matters. You don't understand, she said, her tone rising with tension. You weren't there when my grandmother got sick. You didn't see how my dad handled it. He couldn't cope. He made everything harder. My mom carried the whole load. And I promised myself I wouldn't repeat that pattern. And you think I'm your dad? Reed asked, the question landing between them with a raw sting. Mallory's face fell, tears pooling. Not intentionally. But you do retreat when something hits too hard. I couldn't measure how you'd respond to this. I couldn't gamble with her comfort or her last months. Reed held her gaze, his heart heavy. So instead of trusting me, you trusted yourself to handle it alone. Devon shifted uncomfortably, looking away. Mallory's lips trembled. I wasn't trying to push you out. I was trying to keep everything stable until I knew what I was dealing with. You rehearsed a breakup speech, Reed said, his voice steady but weighed down. That isn't stability. That's planning for me to be gone. Mallory flinched, a soft sound catching in her throat. I only practiced because I didn't know how you would react. I needed the words ready in case you refused to help or made it harder. Made it harder? Reed repeated, stunned. You never gave me a chance to show up. You built the entire situation around the assumption that I'd crumble. Mallory wiped at her face. I didn't want to risk her walking into tension or arguments. She needs peace, not stress. Reed nodded slowly. Painfully. So the solution was to make plans behind my back. To arrange the house. To bring in equipment. To decide for both of us. And if I didn't fit into your plan, you rehearsed how to tell me to leave. The room went still. Mallory opened her mouth to respond but couldn't form the words. Reed took a breath, steadying himself. The part that hurts the most isn't your mother needing help. I would have stood with you through that. It's the fact that you didn't trust me with the truth. You carried everything alone and assumed I would fail you. Mallory covered her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. Devon spoke gently. She's been overwhelmed. She didn't know how to handle all of this. I understand that, Reed replied without anger. But overwhelmed doesn't justify removing me from decisions about my own home. He stepped back slightly, giving himself space to speak the line that had been burning inside him since he saw her practicing. You planned to erase me before she even arrived. Mallory broke at those words. Her breath hitched, and she bent forward slightly, trying to steady herself. I wasn't trying to erase you, she whispered through tears. I was trying to avoid hurting you. I thought leaving would be easier for you than dealing with everything that's coming. It wasn't your choice to make, Reed said. Not alone. The room felt painfully small. Devon rubbed Mallory's back while shooting Reed a look of sympathy, but nothing eased the weight of the moment. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sound was Mallory's quiet sobbing and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background, ordinary sounds that felt out of place in a conversation that was reshaping their marriage. When Reed finally stepped away from the table, it wasn't out of anger. It was out of a deep, unmistakable grief. He had come hoping for honesty. He got it, but at a cost neither of them knew how to repair. The moment the confrontation ended, The room felt drained of energy, like all three of them had been holding their breath for too long. Reed didn't shout or slam anything. He simply stepped away from the coffee table and walked toward the bedroom with a slow, deliberate pace, as if each step confirmed what he already knew, that nothing about their marriage felt shared anymore. Mallory followed him a few steps, stopping at the doorway as he pulled a duffel bag from the closet. She didn't try to stop his hands as he folded shirts and tucked them into the bag. She only stood there with her fingers pressed to her lips, eyes wide with worry and regret. "Reed, please talk to me," she said softly. "I didn't want it to reach this point." Her voice cracked, but he didn't look up. He kept packing, steady and quiet, the absence of anger somehow more painful than any outburst could have been. Devon lingered in the hallway, caught between wanting to give them space and knowing the moment was too fragile to leave them alone. "You don't have to go today," she said gently. "You both need time to breathe. Maybe rest, think?" But Reed zipped his bag, the sound cutting through the room like a firm period at the end of a sentence. He finally looked at Mallory, and the exhaustion in his eyes told her everything she was afraid to hear. "I need space," he said, his voice low but clear. "Not because I'm angry, but because I don't know how to stand in this house right now." Mallory stepped forward, reaching for him on instinct, but stopped herself halfway, realizing she no longer knew how close she was allowed to be. "I should have trusted you," she whispered. "I should have told you from the start." He nodded once, acknowledging her words but not accepting them as a solution. There wasn't an easy fix for being excluded from decisions that changed the course of their life. Reed walked through the hallway with his duffel bag, passing the closed guest room door where the medical bed waited. That small detail, more than anything, made the moment sink in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This showed him exactly how she saw him now, and the realization cut deep. At the front door, Mallory whispered his name one more time, but he didn't turn around. He stepped outside, letting the door close gently behind him. The separation wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet, painful divide. Him carrying emptiness, her standing in the house with guilt pressing against her ribs. Reed spent the next few nights at his brother Quinn's apartment on the west side of Cincinnati. Quinn's place was small, cluttered with music equipment and old moving boxes, but it was quiet enough for Reed to think. He slept on the pull-out couch, using a rolled-up sweatshirt as an extra pillow. Each morning, he woke before the sun, staring at the ceiling while the city hummed faintly outside. He wasn't angry anymore, just tired in a way that settled deep. The kind of tired that comes from realizing a relationship can shift without either person meaning for it to happen. Quinn didn't pry. He made coffee, asked simple questions, and let Reed answer only what he could manage. Reed spent those early hours sitting at the small dining table, turning everything over in his mind. He understood Mallory's fear. Caring for a parent through serious illness could overwhelm anyone. But understanding her fear didn't erase the sting of being kept in the dark. He had been ready to support her, yet she never gave him the chance. That truth sat heavily with him, shaping how he viewed the last few months with new clarity. One evening, while Quinn was out running errands, Reed opened phone app for the hidden camera. He held the phone in his hand for a long moment, remembering the first alert he received, the confusion, the mounting dread, the realization that the footage revealed more about their communication breakdown than any potential affair. The camera had shown him the truth Mallory wasn't willing to share, but it had also shown him how far things had drifted between them. That distance had been building quietly, long before the deliveries and phone calls. Reed uninstalled the camera and placed the phone. He wasn't planning to reinstall it or revisit the footage. Keeping it felt pointless now. The answers he needed were already out in the open. As he set the phone aside, Reed decided on one boundary. He would not return home until both he and Mallory were ready for a conversation rooted in honesty, not fear. He didn't know what their future held, but he knew he wanted clarity more than closure. Stepping toward the window, he looked out at the streetlights flickering on, their glow spreading across the pavement. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a slow, steady breath. Whatever came next, he would meet it with open eyes. Stories like this remind us how complicated love and loyalty can become when fear gets in the way of honesty. If you were in Reed's position, would you have stayed and tried to rebuild, or taken space the way he did? I genuinely want to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story spoke to you or made you reflect on your own relationships, take a moment to subscribe. Your support helps us continue sharing moments that remind us we're all navigating life one choice at a time.